Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this little lecture on the critiques and criticisms of positive psychology. My name is Llewellyn van Zyl, and I am an assistant professor at the Technical University of Eindhoven, and I also hold an extraordinary professorship at the Optentia Research Program in South Africa. So this presentation will be a slightly adapted yet extended version of the workshop I presented recently for the European Network of Positive Psychology. They asked me to record it so that they can distribute it to their members. So I will start off this little lecture on providing a brief overview of positive psychology, what it is, where it came from, and where we're going. And this will then lead us into the main criticisms and critiques of positive psychology as found by our recent systematic review on the topic. I will then end off with a brief conclusion and then open the floor to you to make comments about where you think the discipline should be developing into. So, let's start off with what is positive psychology. So, in around 1998, a guy with the name of Martin Seligman, when he became the president of the Psychological Society in the United States, he called for a new focus on understanding the elements that make life worth living. He indicated that for the majority of psychology's development, the focus is really trying to understand what suffering is and what pain, what anxiety and depression is, and we became very good at understanding pathology, but we focused a lot less attention on the things that actually make life worth living. So he called for this new field which he called positive psychology. And he basically said that positive psychology is a field of research that focuses on understanding the positive experiences, so think positive states, traits and behaviors, and institutions that basically promote optimal psychological functioning and well-being of individuals, groups, institutions and organizations. So the main idea was trying to understand what were the positive elements, right, required for people to function in an optimal way. He basically wrote that for the majority of our lives, not our lives, but of psychology's development, the focus is really understanding what pathology was. The issue here was trying to understand what these issues are and trying to correct wrong behavior. So the idea was basically saying that well-being or optimal functioning was defined by a lack of pathology. So if you weren't stressed, depressed or anxious, then you're optimally functioning. But we kind of know that that is not the case. Think even back to the work of Maslow, for example. People that are functioning optimally are different from people that are relatively normal functioning, right? He also wrote in his book, Seligman also wrote in his book that says, if we constantly focus on this negative or pathological view, we reinforce low expectations of people. We create dependency on outside resources, so you become dependent on a therapist to be able to help you to get through these negative experiences. And because we have this constant over-focus on the negative and trying to fix what is wrong, we discourage optimal development. So, Lomans and colleagues actually wrote a very nice paper recently on the third wave of positive psych. And they basically used this metaphor that said that there are basically these three waves of research that kind of in positive psychology, and kind of talking about how each wave kind of developed. So when we look at these three different waves, we can kind of see a clear trend in changes and things that happened over the past 2 decades. So when we look at the first period, was pretty much where it started from around 1999 to 2010. The focus was really on trying to understand what positive emotions, positive traits and institutions are. So rather looking at what is wrong, we try to figure out what each one of these components are and why it's important for optimal functioning. When we look at the impact of negative things like the role of suffering, we kind of understood there that it contributes to well-being in some way or context, but it's not really that important for us to study. When we look at the function of character strengths, which is a fundamental element of positive psych, we really try to focus in the first 10 years understanding what these traits, these signature strengths are, and how do they contribute to larger traits or virtues, if you will, that we find meaningful and important. Our view of human nature was very binary. It's very focused on you're either positive or negative. And the focus here, or the unit of analysis, is really trying to understand things from the individual's perspective. So we had this very strong neoliberalist way of looking at human functioning. Our level of analysis is really trying to focusing on the cognitive, behavioral, and active mechanisms that facilitate optimal well-being. And finally, the methodologies that we use to investigate these things were very elementary in a way. So the one, we tried to quantify everything, and we also favored more high-level experiments because there was a lot of funding getting flown into, channeled into positive psychology, at least in the first 10 years. In the next wave, it kind of started with Paul Wong's paper in like 2011 about positive psychology 2.0. In this paper, he basically said that the focus of positive psychology kind of moved away from understanding the positive state traits and behaviors, but tried to embrace adversity, right? So understanding that adversity is a requirement for us to kind of develop positive state traits and behaviors. In other words, suffering became like an essential part of understanding happiness and well-being. Think, for example, Viktor Frankl, understanding developing meaning, but being in a concentration camp, for example, in World War II. Character strengths was then not just trying to figure out what they are, but we understand now that it developed through adversity. It starts with a coping mechanism, right? You're funny, you're bullied as a child, right? And you make a joke, and all of a sudden the kids laugh and they leave you alone. So you start to make more and more and more jokes. So you start to use humor as a mechanism to cope with the bullying. But because you spend so much time on it, right, you become an expert at humor. So what started as a coping mechanism, because you spend so much time in it, it became something that's unique to you. When we look at the unit of analysis, it was first, like I said, individually focused, but now it's really focused on universal traits, and we started to incorporate more cultural elements into positive psychology and try to understand things from a culturally relevant perspective. When we took at the level of analysis, the focus was trying to understand things more from a multi-level or holistic perspective. So some attempts were made to say that the individual does not just function in isolation, but it also functions within a system in some way or form. And finally, when we look at the methodologies that we used, we started to use more pluralistic and more qualitative approaches, and started to value more phenomenological ideas centered around studying positive psych. So everything wasn't just quantified, we started to also understand want to understand people's experiences. This brought us to the paper from Tim Lomans and his colleagues, and he basically said that we're now in this third wave of research, where the idea now is to say we kind of have to broaden positive psychology's scope and expand the methods that we use in order to investigate positive phenomena. When we look at broadening the scope, he mentioned there are 4 things that are very important. The one is trying to develop more contextual approaches to studying positive state traits and behaviors. These are things more like understanding the individual's function within a larger system, right? And trying to understand the importance of context in realizing or developing positive state traits and behaviors. He also mentioned that we have to start to incorporate more systems-informed approaches. So think system psychodynamics, the Tavistock movement, but in a more positive way. Understanding that the individual is a small element of a larger system, and I as an individual influence my group, and my group influences my institution, and my institution influences my society, and vice versa. So if I'm excellent and creative, I project it into my system, and my system then projects its creativity, for example, back into me. So we have to start understanding how these things interrelate in order for us to really understand how to develop positive state traits and behaviors. He also mentioned that we have to incorporate more culturally specific and linguistic approaches to studying and interpreting behavior. We know that positive psychology is a weird science developed in a Western, highly educated, industrial, rich and democratic environment. And we know that these theories and approaches don't always necessarily work the same in non-weird contexts. So for example, we know that in collectivistic cultures, that well-being is defined more about the functioning of the unit or the family unit or the societal unit or the community unit, rather than that in the Western focus where it's more on the individual. So we have to start to create more indigenous psychologies and incorporate more culturally specific elements and wisdom in the construction of our theories. You also mentioned that we need more ethical perspectives on the management of positive psychology because it does cause harm. So we need to standardize trainings, formalize educational practices, and becoming more a more positive or creating a more positive ethical framework for managing or implementing positive interventions. The next element is more about understanding or expanding the methods that we use in order to investigate positive phenomena. Like I mentioned before, we focus really much on empiricism, so we wanted to quantify basically everything. And now the idea is to focus more on qualitative approaches to understanding people's experiences rather than just testing their relation between A, B, and C. And utilizing more mixed methods so we can understand the relationships between factors, but we also want to explain why these relationships exist. And also understanding your perspective on positive psych or positive experiences. We also have to use more implicit methods to assess positive state trace behaviors. So moving more away from self-report measures to more objective measures, for example. So think about how do we utilize or can use something like projective tests or projective techniques to assess unconscious positive processes. And then finally mention, given the fact that we have so strong computational power, we can use more advanced computational methods like exploratory structure equation modeling or Bayesian analysis as an example. So overall, he argued that we needed to broaden the scope of positive psych and expand our methods. But in order for us to do so, we really have to reflect upon the history of positive psych and what are some of the criticisms and critiques that kind of led up to us wanting to expand our process. Because only if we focus on these critiques and criticisms and addressing them, can we actually move the field forward. So this brings us to a paper that we recently wrote. So my colleagues and I started reading this book on critical psychology and critical perspectives on positive psychology, and we kind of realized there are a lot of things that people are saying about positive psych that aren't necessarily 100% true. So our idea behind this was to say, like, we wanted to go and look at what were the main criticisms and critiques of positive psychology. So what did the people kind of say, the main critiques, critics, what did they kind of say about positive psych as a field in total, so that we can kind of figure out, is this a legitimate fear or criticism, or has it already kind of like been addressed? So we have to reflect upon this in order to move forward. So we investigated, we did this full systematic literature review, and we found around 117 very unique or specific criticisms with regards to the field, which we classified into 6 broad categories. So the purpose of my presentation now is not to add value to them and explain if they are legitimate or not. It's really just focusing on highlighting the 6 broad categories of things that we found and giving you a high-level indication of what the main issues were. As I've mentioned before, not all of these criticisms and critiques are unique to positive psychology, and most of the things have already been addressed in some way or form. But it is important for us to understand these criticisms so that we can start building upon this for future research and practice, but also to make sure that we do not fall into the same traps again. So, what we basically found was that when we did the systematic literature review, we found these 117 specific criticisms, and we classified these things into 6 broad categories. We basically used the tree metaphor, or the growth of a tree, as kind of like a metaphor for this. So we basically said that there are 2 issues at the root of the problem. The one is that critics argue that there's improper theorizing and conceptual thinking, and the other one is there's issues with methods and methodology, right? So the measures that we use and how we investigate things. These 2 issues branched out into 4 different categories. So one was that critics argued that it's a decontextualized neoliberal ideology that causes harm. It's also indicated, they also argued that it's a pseudoscience with poor replication and there's a lack of evidence supporting the claims that we make. They also indicated that it lacks novelty, it's not really new, and that it self-isolates itself from overall general psychology to create its own unique value proposition. And finally, it's nothing more than a capitalistic venture as a mechanism to make money. So I'll be going through each one of these things in a little bit more detail in the next slides. So the first criticism was really about positive psychology has been improper theory and lacks very well defined conceptual thinking. The critics basically argue that positive psychology lacks like this unified meta-theories and philosophy that basically that grounds its science and fails to kind of provide a very clear set of ideas of what actually constitutes positive psychological phenomena, and we're not really clear on how this should be conceptualized, examined, approached, or measured. So the idea is that the foundation, the theory, and the philosophy underpinning our science is poorly defined. So taking all of this kind of like in together, we kind of find 9 broad issues, which I'll go into more detail in the next slides. The one was more about we have poor meta theory, right? So there's a very poorly defined philosophical principles underpinning positive phenomena. The main thing in positive psychology is about virtues and strengths, and even this, critics argued, it's very poorly defined, right? We're even like in contrast with the main philosophy that we are using to justify virtues. We're even in contrast with that. Critics also argued it's not very clear what positive is, and there's this fictitious divide between positive and negative experiences. They also mentioned that there is inconsistencies in how we define and approach and conceptualize positive phenomena. And we've got a very poor indication of what positive institutions actually are. So we would aggregate individual level experiences to teams and to organizations, for example, but it's still only individual level experiences that we create a mean score of. And I'll explain this in a bit later. And then finally, it's also a victim of the jingle-jangle fallacy. The idea that we basically use the same term for different things, or we kind of put a new jacket onto something and making it sound like something new just to make it a bit more marketable. So let's go through each one of these things in a little bit more detail. When we look about the first critique underneath this was that positive psychology has like a very poor philosophy underpinning its science. They basically said that there's no clear criteria for the purpose of positive theories, right? We don't really know what the methods are that we require to kind of study positive phenomena. And we don't really have very clear criteria on what do we need to actually develop positive theories. So this whole philosophy underpinning positive psych is very poorly defined, and it felt to critics, as a haphazard type of approach, almost design as you go type of idea. Because of this, they indicated that we have a very convoluted view of human nature, with this almost ideological positive bias by saying that people are inherently good and not evil. If we take this normal distribution into consideration, a large proportion of people are evil. And by just focusing on the positive aspect, we actually negate a whole 50% of the population. So instead of becoming a science, they indicated that it became a positive ideological bias, right? Which basically clouds our view of understanding human behavior because we only focus on the positive. And the last criticism was really on the fact that positive psychology lacks a theory of human development. Think most other things like behaviorism, psychodynamics, they all have theories trying to explain how people develop over time, so from birth to death. We lack that. We also have a lack of even a basic understanding of how positive stage traits and behaviors actually kind of like develop. So these are the 4 fundamental pillars that critics indicated that we lack, and because of this we can't really study things in an appropriate way. When we look at the second criticisms there, they basically talked about like positive psychology is a very poorly conceptualized view of what virtues are. So when we talk about virtues, we talk about these overarching positive ideas that societies kind of value. And Aristotle indicated that these virtues are things that we kind of like value, and it's basically interrelated with one another, right? It's kind of The Aristotelian philosophy basically said that this classification of virtues are kind of like are neutral and are neither inherently positive or negative, but it's the context that kind of determines if something is functional or not. But as positive psychologists, we kind of indicated no, a virtue is always positive. It doesn't matter. So there is this fundamental difference between how the Aristotelian virtues were defined and how we are actually measuring and conceptualizing it. So we basically then measured, so where a virtue is basically just this neutral thing that's valued in the context, we started to create it as like a measure of on a continuous scale. You either have it or you don't, right? We kind of like delineated a virtue into nothing more than preferred behaviors. So if you have A, B, C, and D in place, this is how you should be, and therefore you are virtuous in a way. So the idea here was to say that all of these things kind of clash with how Aristotle defined virtues. And because all of this stuff that's in place, we also have no clear idea of what virtue ethics are. So taken together, we have a very convoluted idea of what virtues are. We are in contrast with Aristotelian theory. We create virtues or strengths that underpin virtues, and we make them as a series of preferred behaviors, and we say that you either have them or not. We also measure them as things that are in isolation with each other and not interrelated, and so on and so forth. So this by itself already creates issues for us. Critics also had two other arguments that was important in terms of theory development. The one was like, we're not very clear on what actually positive is and how do we define something that is positive. So the conceptualization of positive state strange behaviors are very airy-fairy, right? And it's again depend on context. So we have this, they also argue that we define positive stuff by the lack of negative experiences, which is exactly the same argument we used to create this new philosophical approach or this new discipline. Right? So we're not very clear on what constitutes positive. And the second part is that we created this fictitious divide between positive and negative experiences, this artificial divide between positive and negative emotions, where negative emotions are classified as either good or bad, right? So again, we have this convoluted idea of what positive and negative experiences are. If you think, for example, something like depression or anxiety, let's use anxiety as an example. Is anxiety a negative emotion or experience? The outcome of it is, but the purpose of it is to tell us that we're in a dangerous situation that we need to leave, right? So is the purpose of the emotion, is that negative or positive? No, the outcome, the data that we have is negative because that's the thing that facilitates the change in things. So we kind of also negated the importance of negative things in developing positive stuff. So think about now like post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic experiences lead to growth. We know now that suffering is an important element for creating meaning, for example, right? But initially we kind of like we negated the usefulness of negative emotions in order for us to understand how positive things kind of like developed. So this is kind of like the two main ideas. The fourth tiny little critique that they had was that positive psychology suffers from the jingle-jangle fallacy. When we talk about the jingle fallacy, we talk about like different concepts or approaches are used within a discipline, and we kind of say that they use the same word for something, and because they use the same word for something, we presume that it's the same thing, but we actually have different approaches towards it, right? So we kind of like assume erroneously that just because you use the same label that it's the same thing. The jangle fallacy is basically like we use different terms are used to define the same construct, or we just put a nice new jacket onto something to make it look old concepts, to make it look new, to make it more contemporary for that matter. And I'll give you some examples. So we talk about the jingle fallacy. Think about the concept of flourishing, top-end human experiences. Diener, for example, just relabeled psychological well-being as flourishing, right? Seligman in 2012 said the combination of positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishments is flourishing. Rothman talks about flourishing at work. Keyes talks about you need to feel good, fit in, and function well, emotional, psychological, and social well-being. Donaldson talks about a holistic approach towards it. And the same with Fredrickson with her like broaden and bold theory. So different views, but we still use the same concept of flourishing, and that makes it very difficult for us to compare studies. The same thing, for example, strengths, right? So we've got the Peterson-Seligman approach, talks about the VIA things, and we have the Nemec approach that actually draws from this, but it's two totally different ideas. We also have used the word strengths from the Rapp and Gosha model about the strengths-based capability things, but we still use the things interchangeably. Even the Gallup approach towards strengths, where they talk about behavior and we talk about character strengths, but we still use the word strengths. The same with job crafting, the same with engagement. There are so many examples where we use the same term, but we have different philosophical or different theoretical approaches that underpin it. But yet we use the same word, but it's actually different things. When we talk about the jangle fallacy, we can use the example, for example, like the concept of joy, right, is frequently confused with the word pleasure, right? So we use joy, but we actually mean pleasure, or vice versa. If we think about the other aspects, like let's think about grit as an example, it's nothing more than taking interest and perseverance, putting it together in a new jacket and calling it grit. The same with psychological capital, which is hope, optimism, resilience, and self-efficacy, where Luther just took these things, put them together, form streams of research and say, this is now psychological capital. It's nothing new. It's just new, old approaches putting in a new jacket and hoping that people would buy into it. When we talk about the level of abstraction of positive institutions, think about something like engagement in a school or at work. We all measure individual levels of experience of engagement. So I think every group, marketing, HR, operations, and we measure your individual level of engagement. Then we create a mean score for the department, and then we say, okay, because everybody's individual experiences of engagement is there, the mean score is then team engagement. And if we look at marketing's mean score and HR mean score and operations mean score, and we bring these things together, then we have an organizational level of engagement. That is not the case, because we're still only measuring individual level of experiences. So we tend to have this very weird level of abstraction upwards, but we don't even know what positive institutions or what group flow or group engagement, for example, is. So there's this convoluted idea that individual experiences by themselves lead up to organizational level of experience, and that's not necessarily the case. So this taken together is basically the broad first category of critiques. The second category of critiques is really focused on the measurements that we develop and use and the methodologies that we kind of employ. So critics had this argument that positive psychology shows a very poor operationalization and measurement of the constructs that it presents. We employ flawed research methodologies and we over-rely on empiricism, so making things quantifiable, and positivistic approaches where we observe things in a neutral way, and we fail to employ robust research methods to make the assumptions that we are, or test the assumptions that we actually make. So there are four things here that's important. They measure there's issues with the measurement operationalization, there's an overemphasis of empiricism, poor designs, and a lack of robust approaches. So if you look at the first thing about the poor measurement of constructs, they basically say that we've got like multiple options to measure the same measure. This is one of the main critiques, right? So if we think about something like grit, if we want to consistently measure things over time, we as a society or a collective have to have a shared understanding and belief that this concept exists, and we have to have the same measure, right, to use this consistently throughout. Only then can we say that something is actually very well defined, clearly articulated, and we can use this as a mechanism to predict positive state traits and behaviors, right? But if we think about something like grit as an example, right, just the one concept, a combination of perseverance and interest, there is like 9 different measures for grit, each one in a different context. So we've got the original things by Duckworth, the grit O scale, she dropped 2 items from it, and then it's called the shortened grit scale. We have the grit, the triadic, the teacher grit scale. We have another version of the teacher grit scale. We've got the triadic model of grit scale. So we've got all of these different approaches towards grit, right? And this delineates the impact that grit actually has, because we can't even compare these things now, right? So we even have like things like the academic grit scale, for example. So we have so many measures to measure the same thing that we're actually not even measuring the same concept anymore. right? That's an important thing. Critics also kind of like argued, if you take this back, that we developed very crude measures. So we just make, if you think about something like the strength use scale from Lindsay, right? You just went and asked, created 20 items, strength use and strength knowledge, asked 200 students or 120 or whatever students to complete the questionnaire, did a principal component analysis, and now that is the strength use scale, right? So it's not even subjected to very robust development of instruments, right? So we don't even follow the ICT rules. We focus a lot more on self-report measures, right? And we know there are issues with self-report measures because it's only your perception of your understanding of the concept, and it's not an objective reality necessarily. We favor, again, subjective measures versus objectives. There's very few objective measures of positive state traits and behaviors. And because something is like positively constructed, because we use a positively phrased item, it's always going to relate to something else that's positively phrased. So we always have this issue with multicollinearity. And I already mentioned this issue with the level of abstraction. So taken together, we really have very poorly constructed measurement instruments. And I'll give an example again. If we take the grit scale, right? We recently did this paper on the validation of the grit scale. And grit is indicated as a dynamic interaction between perseverance of effort and consistency of interest as a higher order factor of grit. So it's a two order factor made up with a higher order factor, right? So if this is the case, we tested models. Why does it have one factor, a two-factor correlated model, a higher order factor, a three-factor correlated model, a higher order three-factor correlated, a bifactor model, right? How do these things manifest? An eSIM model, right? A bifactor eSIM. So we have like these 11 different versions of the instrument, but it's still, they all fit the data. So if all of these versions of this instrument kind of exists, right, is it actually a very well-defined measure? I don't think so. The same thing can be said with the mental health continuum from Corey Keyes, where he said it's a function, mental health is a function of emotional, psychological, and social well-being, feeling good, fitting in, and functioning well. He indicated that mental health is then on this continuum, going from languishing to flourishing. But the problem is that it's not a continuum. We're measuring these things as categories. We measure them as languishing as a category, moderately mentally healthy as a category, and flourishing as a category. There is no continuum there because we define and measure it as a three-order correlated factor. There's no interaction there. This is not a continuum, right? This is a continuum. If we take it from an exploratory structure equation modeling perspective, we allow different items to load onto their non-a priori factorial models, right? This is an interaction. So this is discrepancy between how we conceptualize things and how we measure them. If we look at the second component about this overemphasis on empiricism, we are obsessed with quantifying things. We're obsessed with putting numbers to it. This reductionist way of thinking makes a very complex phenomena. We try to delineate it into something so tiny that we can actually measure it, right? So this obsession with empiricism makes it that we're actually telling you, we're prescriptive in what we define happiness, for example, is, or mental health is. I'm telling you with my questionnaire that I'm asking you to complete that mental health is a function of feeling good, fitting in, and functioning well. It doesn't take your understanding of the concept into consideration, so it's very prescriptive, and therefore we kind of negate rich experiences in the measurement of our constructs. Our focus really is on trying to describe phenomena rather than understanding phenomena. That's the difference. We try to understand and predict, or we try to describe and predict rather than understanding why things exist. And because of this, we are become this prescriptiveness, we kind of lose a lot of value in each of our constructs. So if you talk about happiness, for example, everyone has the capacity to experience happiness, but what makes you happy is different from what makes me happy. And we have to explore those elements in order for us to really understand things. The next one critic that they have was that positive psychology over-relies on poor research methodologies and methodologies. So in the beginning, the focus was really much trying to utilize cross-sectional studies and trying to get as many of them out as possible to look at the relationships between factors. Then what we did was we kind of started making causal inferences about positive state traits and behaviors from these cross-sectional studies and seeing how they impact things like health. So there was this whole argument that positive thinking and positive approaches like reduces cancer risk and increases longevity. And for other sciences, they kind of showed that this is not the case, right? It's a small correlation, but we tend to make it something a lot bigger than what it was, and it's in contrast to other things that we actually do. We also pay lip service to our limitations. Go look at any master student study or most researchers' limitation sections. They always say the same things. Small sample size, can't generalize, we need to do more longitudinal research, blah, blah, blah. So we pay lip service to the actual issues in our thing because it's not important for us. But it's important for us because that limitation section is how we interpret the results of the study. And because of this, people only read the results, and they read the limitations, and they make massive assumptions about things. And as I mentioned before, anything that's phrased positively will, of course, positively correlate to other factors. So there is already an issue. And the last one was that we lack robust research approaches. So it's true that we favor quantifiable things like quantitative research, and we kind of negate the importance of qualitative and mixed methods. So there's very few qualitative and mixed method studies and very few experiments after 2010 to test these things. The third critique is all about positive psychology being a pseudoscience and that it shows poor replication. So critics argue that positive psychology is kind of like a pseudoscience that kind of like makes false claims about the benefits of its approaches. It tends to over-exaggerate the implications of its findings, and it's kind of like rife with confirmation bias, and important findings cannot be replicated. So there is a legitimate argument here, and we also wrote it in our paper, that there are elements here that are true. So we do sometimes make false claims about the benefits, like I mentioned about the cancer research, for example. Critics also argued that there are very limited empirical evidence to support the theories and claims. Think about the Losada ratio. We need 2.95 positive experiences to counteract every negative experience, right? So this was kind of being found to be false, and we didn't really update our theories there. They also argue that most of our constructs are nothing more than socially constructed illusions that you can't really measure, and that we kind of like tend to use things from objective science, like let's say neuroscience, to kind of justify the things that we kind of find. They also indicated that positive psychology is rife with confirmation bias, right? So we try to make assumptions and we look for evidence to support these assumptions that we already have. And if it doesn't make the case, which I'll speak about in the next slide, we try to use context as a way to kind of justify it, or we manipulate the data in such a way that we actually can get the results that we want. They also argued that positive psych is nothing more than making tautological statements, producing superficial knowledge, and making objective conclusions of things that we already know, like happy worker is a productive worker. If you're emotionally well, you're going to feel good, right? So it makes these types of assumptions. And they also indicated that unlike other sciences, we don't self-correct. We tend to focus on the same issues over and over, like the Losada ratio, for example, the 2.95 positive to 1. That part of the paper was retracted by Robert Fredrickson, but we still use this as a narrative in our theories. And we always have this circular reasoning that we can't really test. When we talk about poor replication, again, this is the same for the majority of psychological research, but we can't really replicate most of the findings that we have. And that it also the things that we kind of like do have counteracts or contradicts claims and stuff that we know from other sciences. Think about the cancer thing. Again. So it's very difficult for us to replicate our findings. This leads us into the fourth critique, which basically indicated that two things. The one was that it lacks integration with mainstream psychology and it doesn't bring anything new. So basically, critics argued that positive psychology brings nothing new to the proverbial table, and that it basically willfully created this divide between positive and negative psychologies in order to create a platform for itself. So when we talk about like the lack of novelty, critics question the usefulness of positive theories, right? So what does it bring new to the table that we don't already know, right? They indicated that there are no new models or paradigms in psychology. It's just rephrasing things from other disciplines. We have overlap between things like cognitive behavioral therapy and humanistic psychology, but we don't acknowledge it, right? think about most of our interventions are basically CBT. I change how I think so I can change how I feel, so I can change how I behave. That is literally what most of our positive psychological interventions are, but we don't necessarily acknowledge this. We also tend to over-exaggerate the findings that we make. So we find a small correlation and a small effect, and then we justify this, that this is the end-all and be-all, and it will always work. Like the gratitude visit indicates that it will always generate some positive thing, right? But that's not necessarily the case. We also know from other studies that when people do the gratitude visit or the 5 acts of kindness exercise, it actually increases their anxiety, depression, and stress. So it's not always a positive thing. And yeah, so that's kind of like the stuff about the lack of novelty. And they also argued that it lacks integration with mainstream psychology. So we kind of like isolated ourselves from general psychology to create our own value proposition, and we don't incorporate of things that we already kind of like know about psychological functioning in our understanding of the development of positive experiences or phenomena. Because of this, we have a very shallow interpretation of reality, and we're very unreflective on these critiques. Right? So people make critiques and we just negate them and say, oh, they're just like against the paradigm. We don't really address them. And because of this, it creates a lot of barriers to new discoveries, right? So, yeah, and I think I also mentioned things about like the historical origins of the field is negated. So we negate the stuff of Maslow and Carl Jung as being the first positive psychologist, in my opinion, because he's the first person that studied creativity and archetypes and, you know, positive orientated things. So we negate their things just create new things for the sake of doing it. Okay. The fifth one is the one that I want to spend a little bit more time on because I feel this is the most important one. So, and there's a lot of valid arguments here. So the one is that they indicate that it's like a decontextualized neoliberal ideology that causes harm. So the critics basically said that is this neoliberal ideology where optimal functioning is kind of positioned or seen as nothing more than an individual enterprise. And it's a consequence of my own life choices. I'm the one that's in control here, my environment, and these things don't play that big of a role. And it neglects the role of context and environment in our understanding of positive phenomena, which in effect causes harm. So if we think about things like this decontextualized neoliberal, ideology, the importance of the group and society is negated. So, for example, if you think about the happiness pie from Sonia Lubomirsky, where she indicated that 50% of your level of happiness is genetically imprinted, where 10% is contextually bound, environmental, and 40% is your direct control. We know that if you're in a bad situation, in a bad environment, it doesn't matter how much you have stuff that exercises you're going to do, it's not going to change it, right? So the environment does play a bigger role, but we tend to negate that. So if we look at this decontextualized neoliberal thing, the decontextualization of positive psych means that positive psychology is basically developed in this weird environment, in Western, highly educated, individualistic, rich and democratic environments. So think about the American model. So they created, for example, the VIA strengths inventory, and they said that this is a universal instrument that's applicable for everybody. But when we look at things about the VIA strengths, we test the psychometric properties of it, we don't even find the same factorial models than they did back then. And we also know that when we do investigations into strengths in different communities, even within Western communities, like we did something recently about the strengths of the LGBTQ community, and we found that different strengths came out, like pride, for example, right? So there are different approaches, and these approaches don't necessarily apply the same to different environments. Like I mentioned before, the well-being stuff is being a function of the group in collectivistic cultures, where in individualistic cultures it's more about me. But we say that this feeling good, fitting in and functioning well approach from Corey Keyes is the most important model for understanding positive state traits and behaviors, or mental health, for that example. They also mentioned that we kind of ignore context. So we don't really develop culturally specific or we don't even use indigenous knowledge when we create new theories. But we use context at the end to justify when our studies don't take place. I do the same. So when colleagues of mine, for example, did the study on job crafting and they did this intervention and they found no changes in pre, post and post measures, right? And then at the end, so there's no changes. But in their argument in their paper, actually our intervention did work because the company was going through this restructuring. And we know that when a company goes through restructuring, it makes them anxious, there's a lot of uncertainty, blah, 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 blah. And our studies show that our intervention actually buffered against these negative experiences. No, your intervention didn't work. You used the context to justify the reason why your intervention didn't work and selling it as if it did work. So using the context as a mechanism to explain things that they're not there, but not utilizing the context when we design our actual studies. We create these universal truths and objective truths. That's not necessarily the case. A happy worker is not always a productive worker, right? A motivated employee is not always going to perform. But we create these universal rules to kind of justify certain things within companies or in environments. The things that we do, we say that they're value neutral, but they're not because we're becoming very prescriptive. And we also know that there's a lot of gender, class, ethnicity, power, relations, and societal bias in our studies, right? So we kind of do know these things, but we don't actively address them. The second part is that I spoke about this a little bit before, but that it's a neoliberal ideology. And the idea behind this that says that it's an ideology, not a science. It's a belief system that the individual is the end all and be all, and my life choices is what defines my success. They also indicated that positive psychology is very focused on controlling everything that's related to studying something positive, and it's a political game rather than a actual true science, right? It basically also indicates that the individual is the main agent, the main person that attributes to these things, and that it's very much focused on trying to get external goals. If I achieve external goals, I'm going to be happy, rather than focusing on things that's inside of me. And it's also nothing more than a social response to unrealistic expectations that's kind of like set. So it's an ideology, it's focused on the individual, and you're in control of all of your actions, and this is not necessarily the case. Again, like I mentioned about the individualistic versus collectivistic culture stuff before. And taking this in consideration, it does cause harm. And that is something that kind of like resonated with me when we were doing this study. I didn't really think about it from this perspective. And positive psychology and approaches and interventions can actually cause harm. So the idea behind this is saying that we started off by normalizing we made normal behavior pathology, going through these ups and downs. Every person goes through these ups and downs on a single day. Stress, depression, anxiety, stress. Like normal ups and downs, we started saying if you're not optimally functioning, there's a massive issue with you. So we created a pathology around this so that we can kind of like give you a service to kind of address these things. Because of this, we also create stigma. So when we create categories of people that are flourishing and are optimally functioning, we automatically create a category of people that are not flourishing, that are languishing. And being in that category does create stigma and harm, right? Again, like I've mentioned in the previous slide, it reinforces cultural stereotypes. It reinforces ideas that, false ideas that we do have about societies. Right? Especially with regards to things like gender and, oh, female individuals are a lot more empathic than males, right? So we test these assumptions and we kind of find evidence for it, and then it reinforces these ideas that we have, these illogical ideas. We ignore marginalized groups like the LGBTQ community in the construction of our theories, and we negate them or just throw them into the bigger pot and say, oh, they're outliers, but they're a part, but they're also kind of like the same. We kind of also set these unrealistic goals that people cannot achieve. And we know that if we set a very unrealistic goal and we don't have the capacity to achieve it, our level of happiness is going to fall a lot lower because we don't achieve these goals. And then finally, our interventions do cause harm. I mentioned before about the gratitude visit, for example, or the doing 5 random acts of kindness on a single day. Multiple studies show that they ask people like engineers and so on to go do these things, and they come back and they report a lot more stress, depression, and anxiety, right? Because it's not part of who they are. And because the interventions don't fit their personalities, it actually does create harm. Think about this super introvert. Now you're forcing this person to go do random acts of kindness. It's going to make them very uncomfortable. but we also know now that things like personal intervention fit, and these things are very important for us. But overall, we did start to address these issues, but overall it is important for us to understand that positive psychological intervention approaches can marginalize people and it can cause harm. The last critique is that it's a capitalistic venture. So it's nothing more than a tool that aims to commercialize everything related to positivity as a means to kind of like further this individualistic neoliberal idea, to further consumerism, and it creates this Americanization of positive experiences. So they indicated that it's a mechanism to kind of like sell goods, products, and services, and the idea was that or it was positioned that you need positive psychology to be happy. If you don't take positive psychological approaches, you're only always going to be in this optimal range of normal, and you'll never be the best possible versions of yourselves. So we created this idea that happiness is kind of a function of A, B, and C, so we medicalized it, and that we can actually create tools, and we can give you tools and assessments and coaching and all of these things to help you to be happy. Right? So we created the system. And it created this market of impossible dreams, where we created this, if you're not this highly functioning super millionaire, you're never going to be the best possible version of yourself. But I can help you with my tools and techniques. So I can sell these things to you. Okay, so taken together, we kind of like know that these are the 6 broad categories of issues that positive psychology kind of like has. But it's important to also know that not all of these things are unique to positive psych itself. The replication crisis, for example, the 100 Labs project, where they try to replicate the 100 most, the 100 most famous studies, and they couldn't even replicate, like, I think 95% of them, right? Because our perceptions of things change over time. We kind of know that most psychological approaches focus on self-report rather than objective measures, right? When we talk about the capitalistic thing, of course something is going to be capitalistic in nature if there's a need for it. The higher the need, the more people see the value in it, the more goods, products, and services are going to be there. Right? So not all of these things are valid assumptions. But it is important for us to understand how critics view our approach so that we can actually start addressing these things. For example, instead of justifying why our results did not come out the way in which we did, we basically have to update our theories to say in certain contexts these things don't work and why. So with all of this kind of like said, I think we're at the brink of doing something absolutely revolutionary. Right? But it is important for us to understand these foundations and do not take these criticisms and critiques lightly, right? And actively reflect upon them. So my question to you is, how are you going to go about addressing these criticisms and critiques in your own life, in your own practice, and in your own research? In the comments below, if you can, share some of your ideas with me, because I really want to learn from you and with you. So with that said, thank you very much for your time and have an absolutely amazing